The morning light slipped through the cracked blinds of the old diner, casting pale stripes across the floor. As she stepped inside, the sound of the doorbell above her head, barely noticeable over the chatter and clinking cups her boots were worn. Her jacket creased and faded, her hair tied back in a loose braid that spoke of a long road behind her, the kind that left people wondering where she had come from and where she was headed. She moved with quiet confidence, though the years had clearly been hard on her. She was not one who sought attention, yet she drew it effortlessly as soon as she walked in. The tattoo on her forearm was the first thing anyone saw, a strange emblem half hidden by the rolled sleeve of her jacket. The ink was weathered, but the shape distinct. It carried an air of meaning that few understood, and fewer dared to ask about. The men at the counter nudged each other, whispering under their breath as they tried to guess its story. One of them, a tall man in a work shirt, smirked and said loud enough for her to hear, "Looks like prison ink to me." His friends chuckled and turned back to their coffee, waiting for her to react, but she did not even glance their way. She made her way to an empty booth near the back, her steps slow measured. She sat down and placed a small, worn leather bag beside her on the seat. Her hands rough and marked with faint scars folded around the coffee cup the waitress brought. She thanked her in a low voice, the kind that carried weight and history, though. Few words. She sipped her drink, staring out the window at the stretch of road disappearing into the horizon, her expression unreadable. The diner was a small one, the kind that had seen better days. The walls lined with faded photographs of fishing boats and old regulars smiling at cameras long forgotten. The air smelled of coffee and fried eggs and dust and memory. The people there all seemed to know each other, and they watched her with the uneasy curiosity that small towns reserve. For strangers, she felt their eyes but said nothing. She had grown used to being observed, to being misjudged. Outside, a truck engine rumbled past the sound, fading into the distance, and the door opened again. A man walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, his posture too straight to be ordinary. He wore jeans and a plain dark jacket, his hair short, his gaze sharp, though calm. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent years in discipline. Years that left a trace in every motion he gave. The room a quick glance, then his eyes landed on her and stopped. Something in the air shifted almost imperceptibly. The laughter at the counter dulled, as though the sound itself hesitated. The man stood still for a moment before heading to a booth. At the far side of the diner, his expression unreadable, but his gaze drawn again and again to the faint mark on her arm. The tattoo that others mocked now held his full attention. She noticed it too, though she pretended not to. Her fingers tightened. Slightly around her cup, she could feel the weight of his stare, though it was not hostile. It was searching, as if he recognized something she did not yet understand. Her heartbeat slowed, not out of fear, but instinct, an old reflex that told her when. The past was about to surface. The men at the counter kept up their mocking remarks, their laughter sharp and nervous, perhaps sensing that something in the air had changed. One of them leaned back in his seat and called out to her, "Hey lady, nice artwork." "What does it mean?" She looked up at them, her eyes calm, steady. No anger, just a long, unbroken stare that seemed to pass right through them. They shifted uneasily, unsure how to read her silence before turning away, muttering to each other to mask their discomfort. The man in the corner, however, did not look away. His memory stirred by something deep. The mark on her arm was not one he could forget. It had once been stitched into the fabric of uniforms, never meant for public eyes, the kind of insignia whispered about in secure halls, the symbol of an operation erased from history. He had seen it once carved into the side of a helicopter door, as smoke filled the sky and men shouted coordinates through static-filled radios. And he had never expected to see it again, not here, not in this quiet, forgotten town. She sat still, lost in thought, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to show that she sensed the recognition forming across the room. Her mind wandered to the day she first saw the tattoo on another arm, her father's, his voice telling her that it was a mark of honor, not pride but sacrifice, a symbol earned through silence not spoken of to anyone. And when he never returned from the last mission, she had the mark etched into her own skin as a promise to remember to carry the story that no one else would tell. The waitress came back to refill her cup and whispered softly, "You doing okay, hon?" She nodded once and thanked her again. The same calm, low tone, then glanced up at the man across the room who was still watching her, though discreetly, his hands folded around his coffee, but his eyes locked on the ink like a man staring at a ghost. He seemed to hesitate, debating whether to approach, whether to speak, and she wondered what kind of stranger could look at her with that kind of knowing. The morning grew brighter, the diner busier. The noise returned, but under it all, there was still that quiet thread of tension that neither could ignore. Her thoughts drifted back to the road, ahead to the people she was supposed to meet, to the reason she had come to this town. But now all that seemed to blur in the haze of recognition she did not understand. Outside, the wind began to pick up dust swirling along the pavement, the sound of distant thunder rumbling low as clouds gathered over the horizon. She felt the change before she saw it, the way the air grew heavy, the way her instincts whispered of storms both outside and within. She took another sip of her coffee, eyes still on the window, but her mind now caught between the past and the moment. The man finally moved. He stood quietly, dropped a few bills on the table, and walked slowly toward the counter as if to leave. But when he reached the space beside her booth, he paused, his eyes falling once more on the tattoo. She could feel his presence, the controlled tension in his movements, the silent respect in his hesitation. He wanted to speak, but did not yet. She did not look up. Her gaze stayed fixed on the window, her reflection faint in the glass, showing a woman who had traveled far and carried more than anyone could see behind her. The voices faded again, replaced by that heavy quiet, as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for something neither of them was ready to begin. And so the morning lingered suspended between strangers, bound by a symbol that neither could ignore, a mark that carried stories buried in secrecy and loss. And as the thunder rolled closer, the world outside seemed to echo the storm that waited in silence between them. The man who had been watching her finally stepped away from the counter, his boots quiet on the floor, the faint sound of the bell above the door echoing as another customer left. The air felt heavier. Now, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming, he walked toward her booth, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent years measuring each step. The way his eyes traced the symbol on her arm made it clear he knew what it meant, though he said nothing. Yet he stopped a few feet from her table and stood there waiting. She looked up at him at last, her expression calm, steady, the way a person looks when they have seen too much to be surprised anymore. He asked if he could sit. She nodded without a word, and he slid into the seat across from her. His eyes studied her face, then her arm again. His voice low when he finally spoke. "Where did you get that mark?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup before answering. "It belonged to someone I knew a long time ago." The man nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. The silence between them grew thick and full of memory. He said softly, "That symbol is not just a mark. It is a ghost I have not seen in decades." She did not react, but inside she felt something stir, a cold wave of recognition, though she could not place why. Her heart beat slower, heavier. She asked if he had seen it before. He nodded again, said, "I served with a man who wore that same insignia years ago. He saved lives that were never recorded in any report. The missions we took were buried beneath layers of silence and denial." He stopped for a moment, staring past her as if looking through time. His voice grew rougher when he added the last Time I saw that symbol, it was covered in blood. The diner noise faded again. The laughter at the counter gone. The waitress watching them from a distance, sensing something she did not understand. The woman across from him took another sip of coffee, her hand steady, though her pulse raced beneath her sleeve. She said quietly, "My father had the same tattoo before he disappeared." The man looked up sharply, his breath catching. He asked her name. She told him, and when she did, his eyes widened with, "The kind of recognition that comes like a blow," he whispered. "Your father was a legend in the unit, though. No one outside ever knew what he did." She asked what happened to him, her tone calm, but her eyes fierce. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze, and said no one ever found him. The mission was wiped from the record. Those who survived were scattered and sworn to silence. I thought he was gone forever, until I saw that mark again today. His hand trembled slightly as he spoke, and she noticed. Scars along his knuckles, the kind of marks only found on men who have lived too long with danger. The wind outside beat against the glass as clouds rolled in dark and thick, the world beyond the diner dimming like a curtain. Drawing closed, he leaned forward and said quietly that tattoo was from a covert rescue team formed for operations that never officially existed. Every member had one, and each was sworn to secrecy. Your father was the only one who could fly through storms without losing his way. He saved more lives than any man I ever knew. And then one night the radio went dead and his helicopter vanished. Her breath caught for the first time since the man sat down, her throat tight, her fingers still tracing the edge of the table as though trying to hold on to something solid. She said I was 9 years old when they told me he died. But they never said how or why. He studied her face. The resemblance hitting him harder now, her eyes the same shape, the same quiet determination. He said, "I think I can tell you what really happened, but it is not an easy story to hear." The waitress approached with the coffee pot, but stopped when she saw the look on their faces. She left silently, pretending not to notice that the air around them felt charged like the moments before lightning. She walked back to the counter and whispered something to the cook, who frowned and turned down the radio so low it was almost silent. The woman in the booth waited for the man to speak again. He began slowly telling her about the mission, how the team had been sent into a storm zone in the Gulf to retrieve classified equipment from a downed vessel that had gone off radar. The weather was brutal. Waves high enough to tear metal apart. The helicopter her father piloted was their only way out. He told her how they made it to the ship, how they fought through wind and salt and fire to pull out the survivors, and how, at the last moment, her father stayed behind to keep the craft steady while the others escaped. He said your father never left his post. He held that bird against the wind long enough for us to make it clear when the explosion hit. We thought no one survived. She sat motionless, her mind painting images of a man she barely remembered, now brought to life by the voice of someone who had been there. She saw him not as a ghost, but as a hero. The way he must have looked standing against the storm. She wanted to ask more, but the man's voice faltered. His eyes glistened as he said, "Your father radioed me right before the end. He said, if anyone made it home, tell my daughter I kept my promise." Her throat tightened. She looked down, hiding the sting in her eyes, her voice quiet when she asked what promise he meant. The man shook his head, said I never knew, and I never found the courage to look until now. She opened her bag and pulled out a folded photograph, the edges worn, the image faint but still visible, her father. Smiling in uniform, his arm around her when she was a child, she pushed it across the table. He stared at it for a long moment, his hand trembling slightly. He said, I remember that smile. He used to tell us that every mission had to mean something, that saving one life was worth risking everything. She looked up again and said, Then why were you silent all these years? He sighed, the kind of sigh that carries too much memory, and said, Because silence was the only way we were allowed to live. They Made us sign papers. They told us we never existed, and anyone who spoke would vanish too. Thunder rolled outside closer now. The lights flickered, the sound of rain beginning to drum on the roof. She sat back in her seat, her mind spinning the pieces of her life shifting into place in ways that frightened and steadied her at once. She said softly, "So he died for something no one will ever know." The man shook his head, said, "No, now you know. And that means he did not die for nothing." She asked him why he cared now after all these years, and he said, "Because I am dying too. The doctors say it is a matter of months, and I could not leave without facing what I left behind." He glanced again at her tattoo and said that Mark was never meant to fade. But to remind us who we once were, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal tag, dull and worn. He placed it on the table. She looked at it and froze. It bore her father's name. Her fingers closed around it as if holding a piece of the past she had dreamed of, but never believed she would touch. Tears filled her eyes, though she blinked them away, refusing to break in front of the man who had come as both messenger and witness. She said quietly, "Thank you." He nodded, his voice hoarse, when he replied, "Do not thank me. I am only here because he saved me, and I owed him my life." The storm outside grew louder, lightning flashing through the windows for a moment. The room bathed in white light, her face illuminated against the darkness, and he saw again the reflection of the man he once followed into fire. He felt something like peace settle in his chest. He said, "There is more you should know. Your father was not lost at sea. Not entirely. There were reports years later of a man rescued by locals near a small island off the coast, but the files were sealed before anyone could confirm it." She looked up sharply, her heart racing. "You mean he might still be alive?" He hesitated, said, "I cannot promise anything. The ocean takes more than it gives." But there were whispers, and I never stopped listening. Until now. I never found proof. But if anyone could survive, it would be him. She sat back, eyes fixed on the rain, her mind burning with hope and fear. He watched her and said, "If you decide to look for him, you will not be alone. There are still a few of us left, men who owe him more than we can repay." She looked at him a long time, the silence stretching as thunder rolled again. Then she said, "I do not know if I can find him, but I will try." He nodded and said, "Then you carry the last mission of the team. Her father began it, and now you finish it." She reached across the table and shook his hand, his grip firm though weak with age, and when their hands parted he smiled faintly, a rare quiet smile of relief. As the rain poured outside, he stood slowly pulling his jacket close and said, "Take care of that mark. It carries more truth than most of the world ever will." Then he walked toward the door and disappeared into the storm, leaving her alone in the booth, her coffee cold, the dog tag still warm in her hand. She stared at it for a long time, feeling the pulse of something old, something alive. And as the thunder faded and the wind began to calm, she realized the silence left behind was not emptiness, but the beginning of something larger, a call she could not ignore, a story that was no longer buried. The rain slowed as dawn began to break over the horizon, the sky pale and washed clean by the storm. She sat in the empty diner long after the man had gone, the photograph and dog tag resting on the table before her. The waitress had stopped asking if she needed anything, sensing that she was no longer truly there. Her eyes fixed on the small piece of metal that carried her father's name, the faint letters catching the first light of morning. She traced them slowly with her thumb, as if trying to draw warmth from the memory of a man she barely knew, but had always carried within her. Outside, the road gleamed, wet and silver, stretching out toward the unknown. She felt the weight of everything that had just happened pressing on her chest, not as fear, but as purpose. She could still hear the old soldier's voice telling her that her father might have survived, that his story might not have ended in fire and sea. The thought burned through her like a promise she could not ignore. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folded map, one that had guided her across the country and now would guide her farther. Still, her hand moved across the inked lines, stopping near the coast where the island he had spoken of might have been. She left a few bills on the table and rose the bell over the door, chiming softly as she stepped out into the cool morning air. The town was quiet, the smell of rain and asphalt sharp in her lungs. She looked once over her shoulder at the diner, its windows glowing faintly, then turned away, her boots splashing through puddles as she walked toward her truck. She slid into the seat, started the engine, and for a long moment simply sat there watching the sky lighten over the horizon. As she drove, the roads grew narrower, the towns fewer, the silence deeper. She thought of her father, his voice, his hands, the way he had carried. A calmness that she now recognized in herself. She imagined the night of the mission, the roar of the storm, the heat, the smoke, the sound of men shouting through static, and then the moment he must have chosen to stay behind to hold the aircraft. Steady. She understood him now. The choice, the duty, the sacrifice. She whispered to herself that she would find the truth, no matter what, waited at the end of it. Hours passed. The coast came into view, a gray stretch of cliffs and waves beating against stone. She parked near an old pier, the wood dark with salt and time. A fisherman watched her from a distance, his eyes curious. She approached him and asked if he knew of an island out past the bay. His face changed. He looked away for a moment, then said there are many but only one that the locals do not visit. She asked why. He said, because strange lights are seen there sometimes, and voices on the wind. She thanked him and walked to the edge of the pier, staring out at the endless water. The tide pulled and whispered below her. She closed her eyes, the sound of waves blending with the faint echo of a memory, her father's voice telling her to be brave, to always listen to what the world tried to say when no one else could hear. She opened her eyes and saw a small boat tied to a post. The oars still wet, she untied it, stepped in and pushed off the shore, the water cold against her hands as she rowed toward the open sea. The wind grew stronger, the sky shifting from gray to gold. The island, appearing faintly in the distance, a shadow against the horizon. Her arms ached, her breath steady, her eyes fixed ahead. The closer she came, the clearer it became, a strip of land covered in green and stone, a small beach glistening in the morning. Light, she reached it, pulled the boat onto the sand and stood still for a moment listening. There was only wind and the cry of distant gulls. She began to walk the path winding through trees and rock until she reached a small clearing.